This month, we're asking for your support through our premium programs via The Escapist Plus and YouTube memberships. Your support allows us to continue making the content we want instead of chasing algorithms or the latest trends. Plus, you get a bunch of perks like ad-free viewing via The Escapist Plus on our main website, early access on YouTube via YouTube memberships, and bonus content like our monthly Ask the Creators video series where we answer your burning questions. Thanks in advance for your continued support. It genuinely means the world to us. It's been about a year since the release of Joker, and as such it's strange to look back on the moral panic that surrounded the film during its development and in the run-up to its initial release. In hindsight, that moral panic seems absurd. Joker won the Golden Lion at the Venice Film Festival, picked up the highest number of Oscar nominations at the 92nd Academy Awards, and became one of the highest-grossing movies of last year. It is also the most profitable comic book movie ever made. The film gestures, in the broadest possible terms, at biting social issues. It is also built around an established intellectual property, and owes a sizable debt to the films of Martin Scorsese, especially Taxi Driver and The King of Comedy. However, in the lead up to the film's release, Joker became caught up in the surreal aspect of the culture war. As soon as trailers were released, online commentators became concerned that the movie might, and I quote, portray disaffected white men doing violence as sympathetic, or that the film might encourage the lonely white boys who relate to it. A leaked version of the script before the movie's release sparked a panic that an incel Joker movie could inspire real-life violence. Of course, there are documented cases of films inspiring real-life acts of violence. An obvious point of comparison in terms of Joker was the 2012 shooting in Aurora at a screening of The Dark Knight Rises. Let's leave that one aside because it's controversial and because there's various arguments to be made about the weighting of certain statements made by particular individuals during the lead up to and during the court case that ensued. Instead, let's look at the cases where the violence is incontrovertibly linked to the movie in question. In terms of movies that Joker explicitly references, Taxi Driver directly inspired John Hinckley Jr. to shoot President Ronald Reagan in the hopes of earning the affection of actor Jodie Foster. Murderers Sarah Edmondson and Benjamin Darras were allegedly inspired by watching Natural Born Killers. In May 2011, bank robbers in Chicago allegedly took their cues from Ben Affleck's The Town. However, lawsuits seeking to hold these films responsible for the crimes in question have been thrown out of court. The legal threshold for incitement to violence is quite high, and none of these films come close to meeting it. Although this is a video about pop culture, and you probably shouldn't come here for political insight, it seems highly likely that it would be more productive to discuss issues like access to firearms. Much like arguments over mental health, these moral outrages over mass media are a convenient smokescreen disguising the real issue. There's a long history of moral panics when it comes to the arts. There's always been anxiety over music perceived to have sinister undertones that might corrupt the impressionable minds listening to it. As early as the 1920s, jazz and the blues were derided as the devil's music. The raw sexuality of Elvis Presley and other rock and roll icons, including Cliff Richard, yes, that Cliff Richard, terrified parents and moral leaders. This is to say nothing of the satanic panic over heavy metal in the 1980s and the 1990s. Plus, this is a video game website, so you don't need me to tell you about the moral panic over video games like, for example, Doom or GTA, or the countless other ones that ensued during the late 90s and into the 21st century. You know all this already. Still, the panic over Joker was particularly palpable. In the months leading up to the release, critics weighed in on nothing more than a leaked script. In its festival review of the film, Entertainment Weekly announced that it had, quote, chosen not to grade Joker, unquote, as if Joker was no mere movie. At Slate, Sam Adams lamented, no matter how emphatic Phoenix's performance, it feels like a risk to feel too much for him, not knowing who might be sitting next to you in the theater, using his resentments to justify their own. I really hope we had some ominous scare music to go with that. For his part, director Todd Phillips stirred the pot in his own way by claiming that the film was under attack from the far left and complaining that woke culture had ruined comedy, even as his work on the decidedly unwoke Hangover films served as a stepping stone to a $70 million studio movie that would gross over $1 billion worldwide. On the other extreme, critic Jessica Kiang worried about mainstream audiences' capacity to handle the art house seriousness and unabashed provocation usually reserved for independent cinema in a mainstream capacity. Look, There absolutely is a valid discussion to be had about the content of the art we consume, particularly the underlying assumptions that are passively absorbed by an audience. The question of whose stories we deem worth telling, or why a film assumes that an audience's sympathy will go one way or another. There are genuinely valid and interesting discussions to be had about things like the portrayal of white male rage on screen. But the arguments about Joker were frequently apocalyptic in scale. Of course, in reality, Joker was a studio film, built around an established and highly valuable intellectual property. While Warner Brothers are known for being a more director-friendly studio than many of their competitors, given the importance of the Batman brand to the company, there was simply no way that the studio was going to allow a pro-incel movie to move through their production pipeline unobstructed. Joker was never going to be anywhere near as provocative as its inspirations. In fact, the most interesting thing about Joker is how carefully and how calculatedly the film avoids so many of the potential hazards suggested by updating films like Taxi Driver and like The King of Comedy within the framework of a 21st century studio film. To pick a couple of examples, while a lot of the violence in the original Taxi Driver is clearly racially motivated, and that's even in the toned-down version of Paul Schrader's script that was filmed, Joker makes a conscious and concerted effort to avoid racializing its own violence. Repeatedly over the course of Joker, people of color respond to Arthur Fleck with empathy and compassion. His social worker Deborah Kane tries to help him, but she can't due to budget cuts. A kindly clerk at Arkham, who is clearly overworked, tries desperately to protect Arthur from a horrific truth buried in his file. Even his neighbor Sophie is patient with him when she really has no cause to be, although the film suggests that she might possibly just be trying to appease him, given that he's standing in her room clearly having a psychotic break. However, when the film does offer Arthur a chance to racialize his anger, he consciously rejects it. This is obvious during a small scene with his co-worker Randall, wherein he discusses an attack that occurred at the start of the film when he was beaten by a group of non-white youths.
Fucking savages.
It was just a bunch of kids. I should have left it alone.
Similarly, while Taxi Driver explicitly roots Travis Bickle's frustration and violence in his attitudes towards women, Joker sidesteps this. Yes, Arthur's breakdown is tied to both Sophie and his mother Penny, but the film carefully handles his violence towards women. While various male characters are dispatched in brutal and graphic manners, Arthur's murder of Penny is treated with discretion. Indeed, in the theatrical cut, Sophie's fate is left deliberately ambiguous. A deleted scene confirms that she survives, but even if the audience is expected to read that Arthur murdered her, her death is kept entirely off-screen. In the context of the moral panic around the film, there's almost something endearingly trollish about Joker's refusal to offer anything genuinely and meaningfully controversial. As befits Todd Phillips' history as a documentary filmmaker fascinated with subjects like punk rocker Gigi Allen, Joker often seems like a bizarre piece of performance art. Indirectly, it serves as an illustration of how cheap online outrage is as a commodity, that it can be stirred up by a movie so careful to avoid saying anything particularly pointed. The most absurd thing about all this is the heightened stakes, where arguments over films that people haven't seen yet frequently become existential and apocalyptic. According to some, even reviewing Tenet was actively dangerous. But such rhetoric avoided meaningful conversations, like discussions about the need for radical planning during the pandemic, or perhaps the setting up of social security nets to support small businesses during lockdowns. I guess it's just easier to shout about movies on the internet. Joker was a major studio film, and so was never under any serious threat from these complaints. However, not all movies may be so lucky. In 2018, the extreme right weaponized a series of bad faith arguments against director James Gunn, by presenting a series of bad taste jokes for which the director had already apologized out of context, so as to smear him as a child abuser. Gunn was an established director with a lot of friends, so he survived the scandal. In contrast, other films and filmmakers targeted in bad faith, particularly those that exist outside the regular studio system, without an established track record or support network, may not enjoy the same protections. Quick sidebar here, because this has been a pretty heavy episode, and so it's probably worth taking a moment to celebrate some of the good stuff in life. The scandal over James Gunn was the point at which I really truly fell in love with Dave Bautista. Bautista was one of the most vocal proponents of James Gunn during the entire scandal, jumping immediately to the director's defense and calling out those who were acting in bad faith against him.
I'm not really happy with what they've done with James Gunn.
And to be honest with you, I don't know if I want to work for Disney.
Batista may not have the greatest dramatic range. His roles in films may not always be spectacular. However, I've grown to appreciate Batista as an actor who is willing to put himself out there, accepting small roles in big films with directors that he clearly respects. More than that, there's something genuinely moving about how much Dave Batista loves La La Land, which he introduced for the AFI earlier this summer. I mean, look at how happy holding that vinyl makes him. Come on, tell me you don't love that guy. If we're lucky, some of us will find somebody who loves us as much as Dave Batista loves La La Land. End sidebar. Still, the point is that this outrage has become exhausting. More than that, it's become cheap. And if that's the case, I guess the joke really is on us. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was In the Frame.